Have you ever researched the story behind the story of your specific belief system? I had the privilege of doing that a number of years ago, and the first book I started with was called When God Was a Woman by Merlin Stone. Now, Merlin was one of the first people to explore the archaeology of religion in prehistoric humanity. And I wanted to tell you about what I found and how that impacted my current belief system. So, way back when, in the very, very beginning of when there weren't that many humans on the earth, it seems that across every single continent, they had one thing in common: the goddess of fertility. It seems that early humans were quite impressed with the fact that the female body could create life. That must have been just a wondrous experience, and they celebrated it. And so along the way, they just developed this concept, a theology around the goddess of fertility. There were little Venus figures that were found, little statuettes that were found on every single continent of pregnant women, because that was such a celebrated thing, because women could do something that men could not do, and that was actually create life. So this celebration of life was incredible. The women actually took the headship over the tribe, over the family tribe. The matriarchs, the grandmothers, the mothers, and on down, those were the people who made the decisions for the communities. They were the people who made the religious theological statements. They were the ones who were basically in charge of, they had the power in the community among that family tribe. So as time developed, there were high priestesses for temples that were built for the goddesses of fertility. And she developed different names, and all across the world, there were different names for her in different formats, different powers that she had. And they kind of developed their belief system based on, I need to keep her happy. I want to make sure that we are honoring her in all the right ways. So if something in the natural world didn't go quite right, if there were floods or famines or those sorts of things, they wanted to make sure that she was pleased. And so they started developing, rituals and ways and offerings and sacrifices and things that would keep her happy to hopefully improve their station in life. So along the way, it developed further, where they had different creatures that were their sacred animals: the owl, the snake. They had trees and plants, and they were very nature focused. They were focused upon all those symbols that would represent life in different ways. And so they would use these symbols as reminders of how cool life is as it recreates itself and is born again. And the snake, when it molts and the top skin comes off and the underskin grows out, and all these different elements. So enter the Indo-Europeans who came down into the areas where the indigenous people were, all across that Middle Eastern part of the area. Also around India, there were some Aryan groups that started moving in, and they tended to be different. They were patriarchal, and they didn't like what the female system was. So what they did was they started kind of infiltrating that belief system, but more on that in just a second. So one of the belief systems of this matriarchal religion that celebrated the goddess of fertility and all of her cohorts was the celebration of sex, because sex creates life. So sex is a sacred act that should be done in the temple because it could create life, and we want to celebrate all that creates life. And so that's why sex was part of the rituals that occurred in these temples for the temple priestesses and for the goddess of fertility. So then they had a new plan where the high priestess would choose a male with whom to consort for the year so that she could become pregnant. And this male was called the son of the goddess. He was the chosen one. And from him, she became pregnant. And when she became pregnant, do you know what would happen to him? He would be offed. He would be killed by the other priestesses in the temple, because he was no longer necessary. He had done his duty. The high priestess was pregnant. This sacred child was within her, and he was now going to be sacrificed to the goddess of fertility. And he was no more. And after that point, his name was sacred and he was very special. And whenever people would mention his name, they would say this is a great person because he sacrificed himself for the goddess of fertility. So, this was problematic for those Indo-Europeans and the Aryans who were infiltrating the area because they did not want to be offed after they got her pregnant. And so they started becoming closer to her and changing the theology. And this happened both in Hinduism and it also happened in the Greek belief system and all sorts of belief system all across the world. Again, it kind of all happened at the same time across several hundred years. But what happened was that they changed what the theology was. And now the men started writing the script. And for example, in the Greek mythology, the Odyssey and the Iliad changed Hera's place. Hera was actually the original goddess of fertility. She was the queen mother of them all. There are temples all over Greece for Hera that are old, and they were used for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And the pillars upon which that held up the temple are made out of all sorts of different materials because as the centuries progressed, they had different materials they would use, and so they would update it and use the newer materials and the newer materials and the new materials. So you have all these different materials that were used for her. And if you go to like Olympia, Greece, you're going to find this old temple to Hera. Well, what's left of it, and all these pillars that were part of that temple of all these different materials, way older than the ones to Zeus and to all these other different gods of the time. So the theology was changed, and then it became male-dominated, and then that picked up steam, and that became the basis for Abrahamic belief of Abraham, because this is all happening during Abraham's time, and they changed the story. They changed the story of Adam and Eve, which was specifically created to go against that goddess of fertility belief system. The symbols were unmistakable. And anyway, it progressed with Islam. It progressed with Christianity later on. So deconstruction of our theology, of knowing more. What is the story behind the story of what I believe is part of building our spiritual sense of self. And it is important to make the exploration before you just buy into something that you're being taught. And I think that when you grow up in a home that teaches you this is the only way, doing further exploration just gives you more insight into how that belief system formed, if that's going to work for you, if it is helpful in your growth, if it is not helpful. And anyway, there's all sorts of other things that come out of that. Anyway, I wanted to tell you, though, about this book, When God Was a Woman, by Merlin Stone. It's just research into early prehistory of religion. And it's just the story behind the story. I'll see you soon.